everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And the whiny little pup you hear in the background, that is Naya. She's in here with me today, and she's got a lot of energy, so I'm trying to keep her occupied. But if you see me look away or say anything that's not to Alex, that is to her. Today, though, because we've gotten a lot of requests about it, and it's obviously a popular underwater topic, we are going to talk about snoot lighting and snooting underwater. So we're going to do, I think maybe we'll start with a little history of how snooting all got started and then talk about how we use it with regards to our photography. So Alex, if you would like to take it away, and I will pull Naya out from under the bed.
Okay, right. Well, snoot photography has always been part of underwater photography, and people did it at times, really from very early on in underwater photography. But it never really caught any sort of mainstream traction until probably 18 or so years ago now, maybe 15 years ago, when a Canadian photographer called Kerry Wilk created a series of images that were just so astounding that they sort of swept the board in many competitions at the time. I know these days Kerry's not very active in underwater photography, and probably there's a lot of current underwater photographers who love their snoots who maybe have never heard of Kerry, just because, that's the way underwater photography is. It all moves along. But I was judging one of the major competitions at the time when those pictures came up, and it was the first competition that Kerry had put them into. And I remember saying to the other judges, it's like, there's clearly this amazing series of really groundbreaking macro shots where they were completely black, and then, these incredible details or colors in the subject were lit with strobe. And at the time, we hadn't seen anything like that. And for me, it was just really important. It's not the easiest thing to chat against with Naya, getting you. For me, as the judging, it was just really important that those pictures, won out. And I actually said to the judges, look, we can't just have a scoring system, because what's going to happen is you're all going to pick a different one of these shots as your favorite. And then having chosen one as your favorite, you're then not going to award any of the others. And it was important that we actually stopped the judging, had a discussion about which were the ones that we thought were strongest. And then with the reduced field, then did the scoring, so that because all of us wanted one of these shots to be the winner, we just all had slightly different ones, or not all had different ones. And then we found that consensus. We then did the judging, and those pictures then went on to win loads and loads of contests in the year or so following that. And it spawned a huge interest in snoot photography. And what I find amazing about it is I think some of the shots that Kerry did are still put sort of right up there as some of the best snoot shots ever. But the gear he was using was absolutely, awful he was using super basic, just reduction snoots to create those spots of light. And what happened in the years following those shots is that the market really invented much better snoots, and particularly the kind of optical snoots that, rather than just simply cutting the light smaller and smaller and smaller from the flash gun, they actually use a lens to create a focused spot of light and to get much more of the power of the flash gun into the picture. And I think those are the snoots that we now all use. And I think the technique talk of this should be very much around using those types of snoots. So I've got one here, which it's not as cute as Naya, but I can wave it around in the show. And this is a retro snoots, one of their earlier generation retro snoots. And this has got a lens at the end. It's got a sort of diffusion screen at the back. That's the right distance away from the lens, so that in front of this, it creates a focused spot of light about this far in front of the snoot. And you can use that light to have a very sharp edged beam of light if you get that distance right. And then because it's a focused beam of light, if you put an insert inside the snoot, you can make that beam of light smaller. And there's a number of people who are making similar versions of this type of snoot. This is just the one I happen to have. Some of them, they've got a switch so you can change the aperture size. Others have got sort of, boards that you can push through. But other than that, they're all pretty similar in design and style. And they get much more power out of the flash gun because of that. So, Matt, if you're there, I was going to see if you wanted to kick off the discussion on actually shooting with snoots.
Yeah, so I think when Kerry started it all, one of the things that he was, or the image that was most striking was like that it created that spotlight effect, which is what snoots are kind of known for. They're still known for creating that spotlight effect. And when people think of them, it might be the first thing that comes to mind. Frankly, that is my least favorite type of image to have with a snoot, because I think they're way more versatile than that. I have some retro snoots. I'm gonna actually get a couple more because uh, mine are having some issues. But I also have reduction rings and things like that, which are kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, where it's just a tube that focuses the light. There's no optics in there at all. But my favorite use for snoots is actually for cross lighting or to eliminate unattractive backgrounds or things like that. So where I dive locally, which is the vast majority of my diving, Blue Heron Bridge is not known for its pretty aesthetics and scenery. Not that it doesn't have it, but most of it's muck or rubble or sand or things like that. So snoots for me are actually usually a tool to eliminate unattractive surroundings more than they are to necessarily highlight a subject, if that makes any sort of sense.
Yeah, so you're more typically using reduction ring type snoots
Yeah,
rather than an optical snoot for that type of lighting.
correct.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when you use a snoot, you put it up top, you angle it down, and you might shoot your octopus or what seahorse or whatever it is with the light coming down from the top. And there is a place for that. It's just generally not what I would use them for. I like to use hard lighting or harsh lighting or snoots or reduction rings or whatever it happens to be to create contrast and texture on a subject. So my favorite ones, which we've been over 1,000 times on this channel, are the weird fish like frogfish, batfish, seahorses, things like that. And you can shoot them in any number of ways, but if you can get a texture across them and show all those bumps and the hairs and the grooves and ridges and all that kind of stuff, I think you can take a normal looking fish. Well, not a normal looking fish. I'm sorry, Naya's making a lot of noise in the background. You can take an already cool fish and you can accentuate it and make it a cool picture. I have tons of pictures of frogfish, and almost all of them are taken with either reduction rings or snoots in some aspect. Almost none of them look like they've just been snooted. So I think, snoots are a lot more versatile than most people think about them for, and taking it beyond just the spotlight effect there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, really good points. What I'm going to do though is I think I'm going to cover, a good approach to doing that spotlight shot, because I think particularly on your first few dives with a snoot, that would be a high priority image for people to want to get. And there's a few bits of advice that I would have for that. The first is that if you're diving somewhere where there are dive guides, one of the easiest ways to use a snoot is to actually ask someone else to hold and aim the snooted strobe. And you can either do this by having your strobe attached to this and having the long optical cable from your housing just out loose, and your dive guide is simply going to point the snoot down at your subject. And in places where you've got dive guides who are familiar with snoots, they're very used to the distance they need to hold it away from the subject. And with their amazing buoyancy control and that sort of thing, they can aim the snoot really, really well that way. So I think if you have that access to a dive guide who can do that, I would always encourage you to make use of that dive guide to do that type of shot, because it makes the whole process super fast, super easy. And they can also vary it. If you want a bit more backlight, they can swing the snoot, so it's opposite to you. If you want it a little bit more front lighting, they can move it here. If you want it coming from the sides, again, they can very quickly move those things around and allow you to create those shots. The downside of this approach...
Sorry.
The downside of that approach is that you can only then, if you only do that, you only get snooted shots in places where you have dive guides, and that's where everyone else is doing snooted shots with dive guides helping them. So I would encourage any keen underwater photographer to learn to aim and use a snoot yourself, because that will allow you to get snooted shots in environments where there aren't dive guides. And the key things I would say for aiming a snoot yourself is, first of all, always position the snoot so it's completely parallel to your lens port. So if my hand here is the lens port, I would position my snoot so it is directly above my lens port, aiming down on this sort of angle like this, but that the barrel of the port and the barrel of the snoot are parallel with each other, so that I know that at some distance, at least, that beam of light is crossing where my lens is pointing. I will then switch my camera to back button focus, and I will move in and out with the snoot with the aiming light on until that beam of light comes into the subject. And if that's the right sort of distance away that I want to shoot for the rest of the dive, I'll lock everything down and shoot at that sort of distance. If it's not, I'll aim that snoot. I'll either move it aiming further down or aiming slightly further up to get that lighting right. But it all starts with that really parallel snoot and lens barrel. And then by using the back button focus, what I'm doing is I come in and out until that beam of light is in my picture, and then I stop focusing. And I will know then for the rest of the dive that whenever I'm moved to a position where that point of focus is correct, I also know I've got light in my picture. There's a final part of the technique that you can use when using this technique is because the lens is the port is parallel to the snoot. You can also just use your focus distance to move that spotlight up and down, which is a lot easier than re-aiming the snoot. So if your snoot is landing too low in the picture, you know that your snoot is landing in front of the subject. So what you need to do is you need to move a little bit closer, refocus, and the snoot will move up through the picture. If your snoot is landing too high in the picture, you know that your snoot is basically going behind the subject. So what you need to do is back up a little bit and then refocus, and that will bring the snoot into position again. And I like that approach for aiming the snoots. I have to say that I think the whole technique has become a lot easier in recent years, particularly with the advent of snoots like the mini flash from Backscatter, which I don't always love because I think it lacks a bit of power, but I do find it's by far the easiest snoot to aim. And I think if you're new to snoot photography and you want success early on, that is the best snoot to start with, particularly if you dive in darker conditions. It's so easy to aim. It's so easy to use. Its long, thin shape actually really helps you keep it parallel with the lens port, and I think really helps you make those shots work. But the key factors for me is keeping it parallel, using focus to keep your camera to subject distance consistent, and then you can use the inserts on the snoot to vary the subject size. Don't worry if you end up with a picture that maybe's got a lot of black space around the subject. It's much easier to crop your picture afterwards than be constantly re-aiming the snoot for every subject underwater. So I usually go in on a snoot dive with an idea of what I'm planning to snoot, and I'll set up before I get to the subject on a little pebble or a little rock, and get everything aimed and locked down. And then I'll just use those methods I talked about to tweak things during the dive. How about you, Matt? Does that sound similar to your spotlighting experience?
Well, one thing I was going to say, whether you're spotlighting or not, that you just brought up, is I think is a good point, is to, even if you're going to move your snoot around during the dive, or you're planning on just shooting things at the same distance, to line up on something that isn't your subject first, that's relatively the same size, so you can get your lighting ready to go, and then when you go up to your subject, you're ready, instead of swimming up to it and then trying to mess around, because it might take a while and it could move, it might not react to the flash, or you might finally get it set up and then it turns its back on you, or goes into a hole or something like that. So if you see something you want to snoot, go set your snoot up on something else, get it all dialed in, and then move over to your subject. And that's good for any subject. And I know if you guys can hear that, Naya is once again scratching. Now she's going at the rug.
I think we need to wrap this one up before you don't have any house left. It sounds like there's destruction going on everywhere over there. But hopefully that's been a nice first intro into snoot photography. I suspect it's a subject that we'll definitely come back and dive into again. Yeah. I think, two other uses that people find very good with snoots is, one, combining snoots with long exposures, which can create interesting effects, and combining snoots with artificial backgrounds, where you can differentially light your background or light your subject with a different type of light and create very different effects because of that focused light. But I think that's something for another time. Oh, looks like you want to say something, Matt?
I was going to say we could also cover wide angle snooting, which I think is a little overlooked sometimes, but a useful technique in certain environments or certain situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure we'll be back on snoots again, as long as your house is still standing. So thanks everyone for watching this episode of the Underwater Photography Show. We intend to be back again soon. Bye.